Okay, so as Saul just mentioned, I'm a social scientist, but I'm a social scientist with something of an unusual background. I actually started out life as a physicist. When I was a boy, I was sort of like many sort of borderline autistic children, was sort of fascinated with like the physical universe because it all sort of made perfect logical sense to me. Over the years, I went through various iterations of physics and ended up writing my undergraduate thesis on a very hot topic at the time that was called chaos theory. And at the same time, I was doing my officer training in the Royal Australian Navy. And sort of this combination of experiences eventually sent me off on another adventure to Cornell University, where I arrived in 1993. And at that point, I was sort of becoming interested in, partly as a result of my experience in the Navy, interested in sort of, less of the sort of neat, perfect unity of the physical universe and more in kind of the sort of messy reality of large-scale social systems. And so, but I was still in engineering and mathematics, and so I had to write, my work was very much oriented towards the mathematical view of the world, and so I wrote my PhD dissertation on the structure of social networks. Now, this, of course, was in the mid-1990s, and since then, obviously, social networks has become something of a hot topic. And as a result of that, I ended up making an unusual step for a mathematician and a physicist and became a sociologist. I spent a few years sort of mucking around at various research institutions at the Columbia University, Santa Fe Institute, and then finally at MIT before ended up going back to Columbia and teaching sociology there for several years. And then just when that seemed to be sort of settling down and I finally sort of began to feel like I was a sociologist at last, I left and joined Yahoo Research, where now I work with computer scientists. So in all this sort of to and fro, I've been sort of moving from physics to mathematics to sociology to computer science. I've sort of thought a lot about like what is social science and in particular, is it sort of like other kinds of sciences? And furthermore, is it really a science at all? So this is actually sort of a question that sociologists kind of have grappled with. Now, where I started to think about this problem was many years ago, back when I first left Cornell University, and my roommate at the time in 1998 gave me a copy of the New Scientist magazine, and in it was a book review by this guy, John Gribben, who is a physicist and a science writer, and he was reviewing another book by a sociologist, this book called Tricks of the Trade by Howard Becker. So this was a book that Becker had written to sort of teach sort of young sociologists how to do social science research. Now, Gribben hated this book, right? He absolutely trashed it. And he said, but he went on from sort of trashing the book to more or less trash all of social science. So he says, the research Becker is concerned with is social science, which I thought, and still tend to think after reading this book, is something of an oxymoron, right? He then goes on to say that any physicist threatened by cuts in funding ought to consider a career in the social sciences, where it ought to be possible to solve the problems the social scientists are worked up about in a trice. See, Rebecca, your problems really are not that difficult. A physicist could come in there and solve them in a trice. Well, I thought, this is interesting. I'm actually going to do that. And, at the time, I was young enough and arrogant enough to think that Gribben might be right. Okay, so, 12, 13 years later, many other physicists like me have sort of piled into the social scientists. Computer scientists have followed suit. There's been an enormous amount of activity. Tens of thousands of papers have been written, hundreds of conferences, whole new journals, massive lines of funding have been opened up, all of which leads me to ask, well, what happened? So Gribben, made this prediction. We have all these physicists working on social science problems. What is the result? Well, listen to the last talk, listen to some of the talks this morning, read the newspaper today, look at the kind of dysfunction that we have in government right now, and I would say the impact is not much. In the advertising world, I work for an advertising company, so I sort of think about this all the time. Advertisers have tremendous difficulty measuring the effectiveness of their advertising. In the social and economic world, policymakers have tremendous difficulty still in designing and measuring the effectiveness of the programs that they implement. We still obviously have great difficulty predicting financial and political crises. Economic development programs are still enormously difficult to design, they're enormously difficult to test. Even sort of in the more mundane world of just publishing books or creating movies, motivated experts with years of experience have tremendous difficulty predicting which will succeed and which will not succeed. Finally, educators argue endlessly about school performance. I would say that we have, with all this effort from the physicists coming in and helping us poor social scientists sort of solve all these problems, there's really been no sort of substantive progress at all. So what's going on here? It should be clear that these problems are really hard. They're not just hard for social scientists, they're hard for everyone, even physicists. And in a sense, this should be obvious, right? If you think about the economy, the US economy, it's a massively complex system. Hundreds of millions of people, thousands of firms, hundreds of regulatory agencies, dozens of different kinds of markets, all sort of interacting with each other in complex ways. We know from the theory of complex systems that these kinds of systems are enormously difficult to understand, to predict, or to manipulate. So in some sense, it should be obvious that the social world is very, very difficult to grapple with from a scientific perspective. And yet, social problems just don't seem that hard, right? I mean, if you took undergraduate courses in sociology, it just sort of all seems like it's common sense, right? It all seems like these things ought to be that, they ought to be simple. And you don't feel that way when you take courses in physics. So, this is a sort of very typical comment that drives me crazy. People are always saying, this is not rocket science. These sorts of things are easy. This is Bill Frist opining in the New York Times op-ed section on fixing healthcare. So there's this sort of very clear sense in which when we think about social problems, we think that they ought to be not that complicated to solve. So the reason why this drives me crazy is that, in fact, we're actually much better at rocket science than we are at fixing the kinds of problems that we care about in the social world. When NASA aims a rocket at Mars, it actually goes where it's supposed to go. And if it misses by even like a tiny margin, it's terribly embarrassing. Now, if we could just sort of plan the economy with anything like 100th of the accuracy that we can plan a rocket to Mars, we'd be doing very well. So, here's the puzzle. Why does rocket science seem hard and social science seem like common sense? And the argument that I'm making is that it has to do not with rocket science, but with common sense itself. And this is a point, by the way, that sociologists have been thinking about for a long time. So many years ago, back in 1947, the great sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld talked about this when he reviewed another study, which was called The American Soldier, this huge study the War Department had commissioned, where sociologists went in and interviewed several 100,000 soldiers and asked them about their experience in the army. And Lazarsfeld goes on to cite a number of results from this study. And one of the ones that he highlights is that men from rural backgrounds fared better than men from cities. So then Lazarsfeld steps back from his review and says, look, if someone's reading this, they're going to think that's kind of obvious. Of course men from rural backgrounds fared better because, they've grown up on a farm, they're used to hard living, they're used to sleeping on the ground. Why did I need this vast and expensive study to tell me what I could have figured out using my own common sense? Lazarsfeld says, fair point. Actually, that's exactly the opposite of the result that the study actually found. It was city men, not rural men, who fared better in the army. Now, if he told you that in the first place, the reader could also have reconciled it with other things that she thought she knew, right? Oh yeah, men who live in cities work in large corporations, they're used to wearing uniforms and vertically integrated hierarchies. That's also obvious. And so Lazarsfeld says, precisely, where every conclusion and its opposite appear equally obvious, of course, once you know the answer, there is a problem with the whole concept of obviousness. I would say this is a very deep problem, precisely because we don't understand that it's there in the first place. So what's wrong with common sense? Everybody loves common sense. When was the last time somebody told you not to use your common sense, right? Well, I tell people that a lot. But I don't hate common sense. I'm not opposed to it. I think it's incredibly useful for navigating concrete, everyday situations. I noticed, for example, that nobody showed up today in their beach gear, right? Everybody here is dressed in sort of roughly the same kind of style, and we know that we're not supposed to wear our swimsuits to a conference like this, and we know that we're not supposed to wear a suit when we go to the beach. How do we know this? Well, common sense tells us what to wear. The way that I'm speaking to you now is different from the way that you were probably speaking to each other during the lunch break, which is different than how you'll speak to your children when you go home, which is different than how you'll speak with your college friends when you have a beer with them afterwards. How do we know how to sort of adjust our tone and our volume and the sort of words that we use? Well, that's common sense. You know, I came up here on the Amtrak today in the quiet car, and you know, if any of you have ever taken that, you know there are a lot of rules about the quiet car. You have to sort of be very careful and sort of navigating your way around and not sort of talking on your cell phone or anything. Why is it that people get so incensed when you screw these things up? Because it's common sense, right? So common sense is something that we use every day to help us navigate these kinds of situations that we experience every day. Well, what's the problem? The problem is that we use common sense, and we're so attracted to using it that we use it to solve problems that are not everyday concrete situations. So the kind of problems that I was mentioning before where we have difficulty, you know, these are not concrete everyday situations. These are problems that necessarily involve many, many people interacting with each other in widely varying contexts over extended periods of time. And in these kinds of situations, there's really no reason to think that common sense should work particularly well, and in fact it doesn't. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I'm not going to have time to go into them because I only have 4.5 minutes left, but I want to say something about stories, okay? And I sort of hesitated before creating this slide because I know that, you know, today we're really sort of thinking about stories in a positive light. I want to kind of throw out a little bit of a challenge and a bit of a provocation and say stories are sometimes we use them more than we should, okay? So here's the thing. When we look at the world and we think about the sort of the financial situation now in Europe and how it's going to affect America and, you know, whether we should worry about long-term debt or short-term spending and unemployment, the world is incredibly complex and unpredictable. We don't think that we know what's going to happen. And there are many, many potentially relevant factors that lead to many kinds of conceivable outcomes. And yet, when we look back at the last financial crisis, things look very different. We know that the housing boom was going to become a bust. We know that we should have been worried about mortgage-backed securities. We know that the ratings agencies weren't doing a good job. We know all of these things, and we can tell this very kind of clean narrative about what led to the outcome that we have, that we now know is the thing that happened. Right? So when we look back in the past, we see a very different picture from when we look forward into the future. It will seem to us that if we'd only known about some particular factor, X, right, we could have predicted the outcome, and that we in fact should have predicted the outcome, and we're constantly sort of kicking ourselves for not having known at the time what we should have been paying attention to. So the way that we think about the past is that when we make mistakes, we make them because we just missed the right information. We weren't paying attention to the right things. We didn't listen to the right people. But this is actually a mistake. The problem is that we can't know what we're missing until we know the ending of the story. It's like when you're reading a mystery novel. Like these things are happening and characters are sort of entering and so on, and you don't really know, what the significance of all of this is until you get to the end. But the thing is, the author knows what the significance is because the author knows how the story is going to end and is very kind of strategically introducing all these little mysterious things along the way because he or she knows that when you get to the end, it's all going to make sense. So this is sort of how we tell our own history, is that we pull out all the relevant stuff to tell this sort of clean, linear narrative that makes sense of the world. But the thing is, we can only do it once we know what the ending is. Okay, so I don't mean to knock stories. Clearly, they're very powerful. Clearly, they inspire us. They help us connect with each other. They do all sorts of useful things. However, the problem is that they're so powerful that we are tempted to generalize from the stories that we tell about the past to make predictions about the future. And this is encapsulated in the words of the great philosopher George Santayana, who said, "Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it." Whenever we look back at history, we're always, whether we admit it or not, trying to generalize from it to make predictions about the future. And this is where we get into trouble, right? If we could repeat the situation many times, we could actually make these kinds of inferences. So this is where common sense works, because in everyday situations, we get to experience them over and over again, and so we can actually figure out these laws of cause and effect. The problem is in these large-scale complex systems, things like the education system, the healthcare system, whether to go on to war in Iraq or not, history never really repeats itself, right? So we always have this problem of unintended consequences, and we really have trouble eradicating it. So in my final minute, what do I say about the solution? Well, clearly, it can be sort of discouraging to realize that, your intuitive way of making sense of the world can lead you to make mistakes. but there really are things that we can do. Okay, so what can we do? Well, I think the model that, again, going back to my sort of background in the sciences, the model that we have is that science has done historically an extremely good job of helping us learn about the world without actually having to use our intuition. The scientific method, in a way, is learning about the world while having no intuition for it. And the claim that I'm making is that policy, strategy, and marketing could all benefit by developing a more systematic or scientific approach. Now, why is this a good time to start thinking about this? Well, as Saul mentioned, all of the problems, the kinds of problems that I'm talking about, are problems that involve large numbers of people interacting over time. And historically, it's been impossible to measure this kind of activity. So social science is not really an oxymoron, but it definitely has been hamstrung for most of its history. So in the past decade or so, this has really begun to change. That the internet and all the kinds of fabulous social networking sites and technologies and email and SMS and everything that we have and that people use for achieving all kinds of other purposes are really enabling the social scientists among us to observe the actions and interactions of hundreds of millions of people in real time. And I am out of time now, so I'm not going to be able to go through all these sort of wonderful and exciting experiments that we've been working on the last several years, but you can see there Twitter, Mechanical Turk by Amazon, search logs, email, Yahoo Personals, Facebook. All of these platforms, as well as being things that help people with their everyday lives, are also sort of devices like a telescope that enable us to study social interactions and behavior. And so I don't know where this is going. I don't know whether the kinds of data that we're going to be able to collect will help Rebecca solve the health or fix the healthcare system. These are very large problems. I don't mean to suggest that we can study them or understand them just by studying email interactions. But I'm optimistic that when you revolutionize the way that we can measure things and the kind of data we can collect, it's going to have very important effects, not just in science, but also in business practice and maybe even policy development. So, thank you very much.